wanted to sit down and talk with you guys today about how to take your idea for a product and convert it into inventory you can really sell. So I'm going to walk you through the journey that I personally took in developing our different stove knobs, testing different options, and getting from the idea to something that could actually be produced. So my background is not in manufacturing. I don't have a ton of experience in super complex CAD, things of that nature. So I tend to require some practice and have had to stumble my way through a bunch of these projects. The goal was to create a set of stove knobs for the house. My mom had melted a couple and she wanted us to make her a set. We thought it'd be a great opportunity to make something for her, maybe make a product for the company, test some prototypes out along the way, and it'd be good for everybody. It ended up being a lot more complicated than we had thought. The idea was to create something like this completely out of steel, brass, something fancy, something that wouldn't melt. And so I created a step file and thought that it would be perfect. That's why I was willing to pay to have it made. And sure enough, it was far, far from perfect. It had a bunch of different little things that needed tweaks. I put some chamfers that I thought would make it look fancy, be professional, and it just wasn't the best approach. I also thought that maybe the best way of dealing with the O-ring or rubber gasket you'll find on stoves was this kind of hole you'd find here before the D hole begins, but just didn't end up going that direction. We ended up much preferring a bunch of the different flat options. We found those were testing much, much better, getting a much nicer fit. And so I had to take this idea, something very, very basic, creating a stove knob, and actually turn it into a reality. And again, do it without a ton of background and experience in CAD and 3D design. So I had created that first prototype that you see here, and I actually got it quoted in steel, and it was over $1,000 today when I checked it this morning. And so that's just not really realistic, especially when you're on a limited budget and you're gonna mess up a number of times. Maybe if you're super dialed in, but even then, why spend 20 times more than you need to? So we thought of actually going aluminum first, and that's what we did with other CNC projects actually. This is the first time that we ever went with the 3D printing, and it was an awesome discovery. We went with aluminum at first because it was the cheapest CNC route you could possibly go. So the end goal was fancy steel, fancy brass CNC. So we'd practice out of the cheapest CNC route, and that was the cheapest way to practice. Seemed to make sense. But one thing we didn't consider was how nice some of the professional 3D printing could get. I'm actually not that familiar with how much the 3D printing machines cost these days and how good they are. I bet they are way, way better than they were a year or two ago. So it's totally worth checking. But I do remember looking, and I double checked that the machines used to make these, I believe, were a couple $100,000. I think the cheapest machines to do this sort of 3D printing, I think they start around 20 grand, and the more professional, larger grade ones are a couple $100,000. Again, I know very, very little about 3D printing. None of our products are actually 3D printed, but again, we find it just this amazing solution for testing, prototyping, all that sort of stuff. One thing that's great is the quality is nice enough that we're able to actually test fitment, see how things look, get an idea of how they might feel. It's not perfect, but you're also not going to introduce a bunch of issues that don't exist. If you have a really crappy 3D printer, it messes up a whole bunch, it's really rough, XYZ, then you might think that maybe it was your script, and it could have been, but if it was the 3D printer, that might have you on a goose chase that was just unnecessary. Also, things like fit, might be a lot harder to check, and that's kind of the most important part, at least for our testing. I always want to touch on intellectual property. I truly believe every one of you guys has the next billion-dollar idea, so you definitely want to really take into consideration anytime you bring on any new partners. There's real risk, whether it's manufacturing partners, whether it's any kind of partner at all. You really, really want to consider it. The safest route is always the Coca-Cola route. Lock the secrets up in a vault, treat it like Coca-Cola treats their formula, and that is absolutely the best route. We were pretty new to CNCing at the time. We had some experience in sheet metal, but this was something that we were looking to have prototyped up and mess around with early on. And even in this day, it can be really nice to just, if I'm on vacation, put in a order for one of these. It'll often be $25 to $40 shipped. And when I get back, whatever it might be, it will be at my doorstep about a week later. I did go back and actually look at the specifics. The standard shipping on a lot of the 3D printing was 5 days of manufacturing time and then shipping. I actually compared a couple of my order dates with tracking numbers and confirmed that they were actually beating their expectations by a couple of days consistently. And if I would beat the order deadline, which is 4 p.m. for the day, then it would typically arrive within 7 days. So for $25 to $30, if it's really printed with a $200,000 printer, it's not too bad of a deal. It's also really great as a way to test some of these manufacturers. Here at Potomac Standard, we do all our manufacturing in South Florida. We're really, really proud of that. Proud of the hardware we make with our own two hands. And we would love to see you guys do the same. But at the same time, we totally understand that a lot of you just have a product and you're entrepreneurs. You want to bring it to reality, and that's the goal. And that's totally cool too. So if that's the case, starting small with these prototype runs, it's a great way to test the manufacturers at a larger scale. There's a couple dozen vendors out there that take online orders, and we found that the quality really does differ. Some have come in wonderful consistently, others come in consistently out of spec. So what we started to do was actually create a spreadsheet, and we would have all sorts of different metrics captured. We would look at how much they would charge for single prototypes. Maybe some companies are much happier to take on small runs. They don't have a bunch of minimum things in place, like minimum expenses that you don't really get to see. And so no matter what, the minimum price is pretty high. So you're better off going to somebody that doesn't have those. So keeping track of the pricing at different quantities, taking notes of how the products came in, keeping track of shipping times, if you're in communication with any of their sales folks or help desk, how you'd like them, whether you'd like to deal with them going forward. That is a big thing. Some companies have amazing customer service. Others are a lot more like Fortune 500 companies where you're dealing with a pretty robotic help desk and not getting anywhere. Negotiations are also similar. Some companies are totally happy to negotiate, others not at all. So that's a great thing to play around with. Another huge thing is the quoting services. The quoting services are just wonderful. I believe that most of the manufacturers you guys are considering working with, even locally, are using quoting tools very, very similar to the quoting tools on the back end of a lot of these websites. There are more complications and complexities when you're asking somebody local. They typically don't have all the material information and costs on hand, especially if you want to go with something weird. So that's one part of it. Also, you're waiting typically on humans, so waiting 2, 3, 4 days, a week or two even, it's very normal when you're requesting quotes, especially if that CNC shop needs to request a quote of their own for the materials to then put together your quote. So it can just take a while, and it's not even unreasonable. On the other hand, these quotes are literally instantaneous. You can mess around with it, fiddle with it, switch your quantities around, see what different materials look like and would cost, and it takes a matter of seconds. So that's really, really cool and powerful. And then it's also cool and powerful from the perspective of being able to help you negotiate, especially if you keep an eye on the US specific manufacturing. You never even need to use any of these services for manufacturing to actually get a ton out of them. Simply using their quoting services to get an idea of what your local manufacturer is going to charge you, it's absolutely a huge game changer. I also think that it helps forecast a pretty good guidance price to go after. So you want to know what's a reasonable price, and it can be a little surprising. At very, very small quantities, you might be shocked at how much things cost, versus larger quantities, very, very surprised and happy with how quickly they drop. So you might want to play around with that and also see how it differs between different types of manufacturing. Sheet metal, you typically hit bulk quantities at a much smaller quantity, versus CNC, you typically have to do 5x the dollar value you have to for sheet metal to hit that same level of wholesale discounting. So that's definitely something worth playing around with. I think you learn a lot from it, and it gives you a great idea of how much things are going to cost, a great price to negotiate to. It just gives you a lot of information to go off of and will really help you in your negotiations. These prototypes have also allowed us to skip annoying local partners. There's a couple of folks that we love to partner with locally. At the same time, while they would be willing to answer our phone calls and respond to us, we do feel a little bad asking shops that are helping us with medium-sized orders or large orders consistently and never really going beneath that. Because of that history, they would be willing to consider it and maybe break a rule, but at the same time, that's not the favor you're looking to ask for. Even if they're willing to do it, it can also be annoying. So if you ever get that feeling that in some way it's annoying, whatever it might be, you're asking it as a favor, there's probably better favors to be asking for. So again, it's worth considering. Now, if you never plan on going with a manufacturer that is interested in doing these 3D printing prototypes that you really need to vet, like these online manufacturers, it is absolutely worth looking at the 3D printers these days. I haven't done so, but these do add up at about $30 a piece, unless you order them in bulk where they do go down quickly. But you think they're perfect, that's why you're ordering them. So typically you're ordering only a couple at a time. So at $30-ish a piece, if a 3D printer at sub $2,000 can get you something to the quality that you're able to test fitment and measurements, then I would totally recommend considering it, especially if you have a number of prototypes that you're going to be developing, products that you need to work and think through. On the other hand, if you only have a single product, it's probably best to consider some of these online options. I always recommend sticking with the United States manufacturing if possible. It's typically only an extra few dollars. We always do it. And I believe, like I said, these typically run around $30 from the US, shipped with 2-day overnight shipping, or not overnight, 2-day shipping. I looked, they typically run around 16 to 20 for international manufacturing. You then typically might have the concern of customs. You won't with these being prototypes, but it's going to take longer. I don't think it's typically worth the $10 to $15 worth of savings for the intellectual property risk. So absolutely take that into consideration. Like I said, there's always a risk, and You have the next Coca-Cola, you have the next billion-dollar idea in your head. You got to protect it. The next major point of consideration is small runs. Just like when you go to buy wood at Home Depot, it comes in a couple of generic sizes. When you want really small amounts, typically you have to pay pretty close to the whole larger piece. So if you're going to go the route of going with a local manufacturer, getting a custom prototype made, I totally recommend going to the manufacturing supplier, purchasing the material yourself in the standard unit size. That's like buying an entire piece of plywood, not 2/3 custom cut for you, leaving the other third behind and paying 98% of the price. You take the entire piece of plywood home, you get a saw, you cut it down to the size your CNC shop needs. And again, the plywood's a metaphor for metal, sheet metal, whatever it is you're expecting your CNC or other manufacturer to be cutting down. You buy the larger piece, you provide the manufacturer you're partnering with the exact size. If you ask them to go pick it up themselves, there's also that time consideration. There's the fact that they're probably going to be forced to pay that larger sum. Either they're going to leave that material in scrap at the material supplier, or they're going to keep it for themselves. But that money is going to be tied up out of their pocket, and they're going to most likely put most of that onto you and the expense they're charging you for your prototype or small run. I think that some of these online manufacturers are a great way to bridge the gap as well if you need. Sometimes it is just a little bit too expensive to go for some of these small runs. It's not viable for your business. You're going to be losing potentially hundreds of dollars on every single order, and that just doesn't make sense if you're on a really tight budget. So if you're open to having manufacturing partners, if you're open to the risks we've talked about, getting quotes from all these different sources is easy, and it provides you with a bunch of options. Check out PotomacStandard.com to support us. We make amazing home hardware with our own two hands. It's a family-owned company out of South Florida. We're really, really proud of the stuff we make ourselves. Continuing on a family legacy and bringing manufacturing back to America. We hope you guys do the same.